All right. So today we have Andy Sarge McCurdy. He is a police chief in the Pacific Northwest who provides training and consultation to government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and private businesses. Chief McCurdy leads sargetraining.com, an organization dedicated to creating strong, compassionate, and competent leaders in law enforcement by focusing on the role of sergeant. In addition, Chief McCurdy is very active in his community. I can vouch for that. He organizes Shop with a Cop, is the founder of Badges and Barbells After School Weightlifting and Mentoring Club, and a ton more. So Chief McCurdy, thank you so much for chatting with us today. I know that we're probably pulling you away from a workout right now, just judging by what's going on in the background there.
Actually, I was
And
going to see if I could just squat while we're talking, if that's all right. Or
yeah, just answer questions between sets. You know, if you're anything like me, you'll be taking 10 to 15 minutes between your sets.
yeah, I usually try to take 2 or 3 days between sets. So
Oh
I'm getting
yeah,
there.
I
even
like your
smarter.
style.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks again. Yeah, thanks for hopping on with us. I think probably the first thing we want to know is just how you got into the line of work that you're in now. What was a big driving factor? What were some of your influences growing up?
Sure. So I come from a law enforcement family. Both my mother and father were both police officers. My mom was a deputy with Alameda County Sheriff's Office. I grew up in the Bay Area in California. My dad, he started with Oakland Police Department in the early 60s and spent about 40 years in law enforcement. And I have one sibling, a brother. You can probably guess. He's also a cop. He's a sergeant in our Sound Transit Division and narcotics. So I come from a cop family. Growing up as the son of a police officer, my mom actually ended up quitting law enforcement when my brother and I were born because my parents made the decision that they wanted her to be home to try to wrangle my brother and I. And back then, that was a big decision because police officers back in the 70s did not make very much money. So they did have to make a lot of sacrifices to have one income so my mom could be home. But my dad was a very colorful guy. He most of his career, he was a sergeant with the Hayward Police Department. He had some beliefs that were unique at the time. He believed that you should live in the community where you police. It was really important to him to have a lot of involvement in the community. Growing up, we were involved in church, other organizations that would give back to the community. He was a member of the Exchange Club where they would do fundraising, so on and so forth. And every weekend, my brother and I had something we had to do that would either be involved going to work with my dad and, hanging out in the police gym while he did work, or, working in a soup kitchen, giving food to people, the needy, or even helping out people in the neighborhood who needed it. So that was kind of the environment I grew up in. And, I always think about, the kind of the image I have of police officers, and a lot of that comes from that upbringing. And in fact, the earliest memory I have in life was when I was about 4 years old. My brother's 2.5 years older than me. He was about 7 at the time. And my dad at the time was the sergeant with Hayward Police Department. He was in charge of something called Youth and Family Services Bureau. And it was basically part of the police department. It was in the back of the PD. And they had counselors and school resource officers and detectives. And all these people worked together. And, families could come in if they were struggling, and they could meet with a counselor and get family counseling or marriage counseling. They could talk to the detectives if there was an investigation, so on and so forth. But my dad was also the sergeant of the SWAT team. And at the time, it was still pretty early in this whole idea of having police departments having their own SWAT team. And Hayward Police Department wasn't that big a city. It's probably 150,000 residents or so. And it was a little bit unique that they had their own SWAT team. So it was pretty common for my dad on his days off to be going into work to do stuff to prepare equipment or gather equipment or maintenance or whatever. And I remember one weekend when I was about 4, my dad asked my mom if she could watch my brother and I for the day. My mom asked my dad if he would watch us. So we went to work with my dad, and he said we were going to be doing some equipment maintenance for the SWAT team. And when we got there, we found out the equipment maintenance was actually a hostage rescue scenario, and we were the hostages. So I remember the detective bureau there was like a 2-story building that was the police department, and had one of those gravel tar roofs, and on top of that second story was like this box, and that was the detective bureau. And we were being held hostage in that room. There was a table over in the corner. My brother and I were underneath the table, and one of the narcotics detectives with like big long beard and hair was waving around a fake gun, yelling and screaming. And I remember on the other side of the room, there were a bunch of people standing there watching. And I know now that those were dignitaries and city officials and people from other local police departments and such. And they were there to watch the capabilities of this new SWAT team. So we were being held hostage there. And next thing we know, the SWAT team comes busting in and they kill the bad guy and they evacuate my brother and I out onto the roof. So now we're standing on the second floor on that gravel tar roof and we're looking out into the parking lot. And I noticed there's a bunch of ropes hanging off the building. And pretty soon the SWAT team starts rappelling down. And then next thing we know, it's just my dad, my brother and I left. So my dad's like, all right, boys, time to go. And he ties my brother up with a rope, throws him off the building. My brother rappels down, and down at the bottom of the rope is the SWAT team. And they're all cheering for my brother. And they catch him at the bottom of the rope. And now it's my turn. So my dad, I remember my dad was a big guy. He had these huge hands. I remember he tied the rope off and he's holding me by the scruff of my neck and he hangs me out over the edge of this building. I'm gripping on that rope, trying to hold onto his hand. I'm like, Dad, I don't want to do this. He's like, sorry, too late now. And he just lets go. And, I rappel down, and down at the bottom of the rope was this one young officer. His name was Dave. And Dave was kind of the epitome of a police officer. It was this 1970s still, and he had the big mirrored sunglasses. He had really short hair, a big pearly mustache. He was a motorcycle officer, so he always had the tall leather boots and the helmet on, and if a member of the general public saw him, they would be intimidated by him. But I knew him as a human being, and my dad had been Dave's mentor, and Dave was one of those guys who was a little bit controversial. He was a good cop, a hard worker, and he would give the shirt off his back for my family. And I remember many times when in the middle of the night we would need something because my dad wasn't home or something had happened in our house, and we would call Dave, and Dave would come to our house to drop whatever he was doing to help us. So I remember, and also Dave struggled a little bit because he'd get in trouble at work or he'd break up with a girlfriend and he'd be at our house crying about it. And my dad would be there to kind of mentor him through it. So even though Dave was this big hulking guy, he was catching me at the bottom of this rope. And, I felt safe, not just because of his physical stature, but because I knew who he was as a human being inside the uniform. And I knew he would do anything to protect me, and I remember how safe I felt knowing that he was there for me. And that's not the general impression the public has of the police. So I think my upbringing exposed me not only to what cops do for a living, but also the types of people that join law enforcement, the good and the bad. And Dave, like I said, he was a controversial guy. He got in trouble quite a few times. I actually much later in my life, I actually had to report a time when he had used excessive force, essentially, back later when I was working for the police department. But growing up in that environment and knowing who cops were and what good people they were really gave me a different viewpoint of what the profession was and a different idea of why to get into it. So later when I became a cop, I really felt it was important to try to help cops get credit for the human beings they are inside their uniform instead of just having people judge us based on how we look because we're wearing a uniform with a badge and a gun. So that's kind of where it came from and why I chose to get into the career. And I followed a little bit of a meandering path, unusual path, I should say, getting there, but that was kind of the start.
I love it. What an incredible story, and so many just little things that I would love to touch on. I mean, so Lexi and I were talking just before we hopped on about your philosophy around the term Sarge and how that being kind of that frontline supervisor is so impactful on young officers and just in general, and what Sarge stands for you. And it sounds like now, hearing a little bit about your background, that was also what your father was known as. So it has, a much deeper meaning. And I love it. I think that that's fantastic. I was telling her, it's obvious that you've really thought about what an impact that frontline mentor can have on, for instance, the guy that you were talking about, Dave.
Yeah. Well, and the sergeant steers the boat. The chief may be up in his office making decisions and trying to impart new policies or procedures or philosophies, but the sergeants are the ones who are going to make or break an organization. And if we can't capture the support of our sergeants, when we try to come up with new policies, then however good those policies may be, they're going to fail. So I honestly believe that any new projects or programs, ideally they're going to start with the sergeants, because then immediately you're going to have buy-in. But if they don't start with them, if they have to come from either from officers below or from command up above, it's still that critical piece to get buy-in and cooperation, and for people to internalize whatever it is you're trying to implement.
Yeah. And there's no question, like things have definitely changed since your dad was a sergeant. So you're not really bringing your kids into work anymore to do mock hostage scenarios and that kind of thing. Maybe they are in smaller departments, but
Well, I bring my kids all the time into crazy events. So,
and that's awesome. And I think, I hope that that is more of the norm as opposed to kind of what I'm thinking is the norm. But I think that, we're like, especially in a really big department, my question to you is, how do you find ways now to kind of still connect with the community in the way that you knew Dave and you knew him outside of the uniform? I know that's kind of symbolic for you of how you learned to develop trust, not just because your dad was a cop, but you sort of see the symbolism behind understanding the person themselves versus just the uniform. How do you think, there's a struggle with that nowadays, and how do you think officers in bigger departments or even just in this climate today can achieve that?
well, I think we as an organization need to recognize that it's bigger than just us. When we have these struggles with our community, it's usually because we adapt kind of an us versus them mentality. And unfortunately, with human psychology, when we face these tough times, we kind of circle the wagons and we bond together as a group. And sometimes that means it's to the exclusion of our community. So it's always been my goal to look for community programs that can, first of all, remind the public about who we are as human beings, but then also to remind the officers about the public being human beings. If the only time you encounter a person is during a crisis, you've never met them before, you don't have a relationship with them, then that crisis is going to be much more likely to spin out of control. Whereas if that member of the public knows you or knows another officer and trusts them, um, our jobs are a lot easier. So, it's finding that balance. Our primary function is to enforce the law. We need to arrest people who've committed crimes. We need to go out there and sometimes aggressively pursue criminals. But if we don't have the trust or support of the public when we do that, then we're going to fail.
Do you think I love programs such as yours, and I'm, have tried to be involved with them myself. And I think that, getting to know people out of the uniform is super important because you don't have that first impression of, intimidation or whatever their preconceived notions may be about what an officer is going to be like. I also see there's some opportunities when you are in uniform and you are working to start to build those bridges. And I wonder if you could talk about if you have a philosophy of that, or if you have used any techniques yourself to do that.
Yeah, well, first, why don't I talk a little bit about some of the programs and why I started them, and then we can talk about doing it in uniform and the importance of that. So some of the programs I started with, when I was growing up, a lot of my sports coaches in high school, a lot of the people who ran other programs I was involved in happened to be also police officers. My high school wrestling coach was a police officer for Oakland Housing Authority. Two of my football coaches in high school were police officers. Our assistant principal at our high school was a reserve and part-time police officer for the regional park district in the Bay Area. And those were all people who had a huge influence on me. And it had nothing to do with the fact that they were cops. It had everything to do with the fact that they were involved in kids' lives and trying to mentor and have an effect on them, not because it was part of their job, but it was because of the kind of person they were. So I think that the cops who are able to easily gain the trust of the public are the ones who the public can see are going above and beyond, and who aren't just there because it's their job or it's because it's required of them, but are there to interact with people because they genuinely care about other people, because of they view the sanctity of human life as the most important factor. So some of the programs I've started, my goal is, for one thing, to give officers an opportunity to give back and to connect with people, not because I'm requiring them to do it, but because they're choosing to do it. Mm-hmm. But also then, by giving them that time and that access to be able to do that, it also reinvigorates them and helps them have a better outlook on their job. The whole wellness side of things, whether it be physical and or mental, is really important. So a lot of the programs I've been involved in have something to do with physical activity, because I think it's important. There's a great way. That's a great way to build camaraderie with the public, is to engage in rigorous physical activity with them. One of the first groups I got involved in, I used to be really involved as an advisor with our Explorer program. I was actually an Explorer growing up for the police department. So I actually have pictures of myself and my brother when I was like 14 years old, in my little uniform, and So I've stayed involved with the Explorers when I can. That's a great way to expose kids to what law enforcement is, and again, try to mentor them. We do a Shop with a Cop program. We've been doing that for about 15 years. We typically serve about 500 or 600 kids in Covington at our Walmart. And we draw those kids from all over King County, mostly from people who've had negative experiences with the police. So the interesting thing about that, we go to a lot of, domestic violence shelters. We go to places like Mary's Place, Dawn, Domestic Abuse Women's Network, and so on. But the interesting thing about it is, because they show up and we have police officers in uniform who are taking them shopping for gifts, the relationships and the bonds formed between the officer taking them shopping and the kid who shows up who's in need is mutually beneficial. I think the cops may even get more out of it than the kids. But giving them that opportunity and the time to be able to do it and encourage the officers to get involved is that first step. So, having a variety of programs, the Shop with a Cop program, as Callie mentioned, I have the Badges and Barbells. Currently, we have 5 at campuses where we run after-school weightlifting clubs. And the goal with those is that we have cops that are there either on their own time or on duty, lifting weights with the kids as peers. We try to have, qualified coaches there trying to run the program and coach. So a lot of times we have, coaches from the school or cops who are qualified to coach that are there running it, because I want it to be quality training. But it's having the officers in there. A lot of times you'll have a kid who can squat twice as much weight as you, and you have to have some humility. You have to lower your ego and connect with them as a human being. Otherwise, you end up looking like an idiot. And that environment, a lot of cops like working out. A lot of cops enjoy that. And again, that opportunity. So we have White Center Boxing as well. It's a nationally ranked boxing program in White Center. That was started in partnership between the current coach, Tony Rago, and one of our officers many years ago. And again, it's an opportunity to give kids physical activity and outlet, but then to support them as cops in something that's not at all police related. So.
Yeah. Do you, when you're getting involved in these programs, do you run into any red tape in terms of liability and that kind of thing? Because I was always curious if that was a big hurdle.
Yeah, it took me about 3 years to get Badges and Barbells started. I had to work quite a bit with the district to make sure that we met all their requirements. I was really lucky. I ran into met a woman. Our first program was in Highline School District, and a woman there was the athletic director for the district named Terry McMahon. And she had heard about my idea. I had been floating it for a while, and they actually had a kid get concussion on the football field at Evergreen High School, and he ended up dying on the field.
Oh, no.
And they actually talked about shutting down their football program. And one of the concerns they had is that their coaches they had weren't very well qualified. They weren't running a program that was properly preparing the students for football. And when I came to her with this idea of doing a weightlifting club, I have a background in sports performance coaching. That was originally my major in college, and I worked in a sports injury clinic down in California for quite a few years as a coach and physical therapy aide. So I do have a background where I know how to train kids and stuff. And when I came to her with this idea, she actually said, we were talking about shutting down the football program at the high school because we thought it was too dangerous. But if you could go in there and get them a legitimate program started that's going to better prepare these kids, then we'll keep football going. So it was kind of an opportunity, it was a tragic event that created the opportunity, but it was just a really good timing. And I met somebody who was Terry McMahon's, she's still a mentor of mine. I talk to her on a regular basis. She's retired now, but she saw that as a time when both we could repair some damaged relationships between the police and the kids in that community, because Evergreen's in a rough part of town in unincorporated King County and White Center. But also, a way that we could get the kids, hopefully some better coaching and so on as well. So she actually helped me get through a lot of that red tape. And then once that program got started, I try to have all of our coaches be USA Weightlifting certified so that they have some sort of certification. I'm not saying USAW is the best coaching cert in the world, but it's something that means that we can get insurance. And then we really have to work closely with the schools to make sure that we have all the credentials and all the insurance and paperwork and everything in order before we get started. And that was a pretty frustrating process to go through. But once I got one program started, then the rest of them just were much easier to get rolling.
So you said that oftentimes the cops that do the Shop with the Cop, get more out of it than even the kids. Could you talk about why that is? I think for those of people that are watching this that aren't in law enforcement, I understand why it is, but what is it about that interaction that's so important for officer wellness?
I think cops can get really jaded doing this job because we're only interacting with people on their worst day of their life, right? And people don't behave in a typical way when they're angry or scared or whatever the other emotion they're having is. So when we put cops in a position where they get to interact with these kids, particularly kids that are look different than them, kids that may dress different or listen to different music or all these other things, and that sometimes they're even the exact same kids that they are interacting with out in the field, in an enforcement capacity. But when they interact with them there and they build a friendship with them, it completely changes their outlook, right? And not only with that kid, but with the next set of kids they run into. I have one officer who works for me who was really frustrated with his career, was second guessing being in law enforcement. In the area where I work, we've got a drug problem. We've got a lot of property theft and so on and so forth. So he was really frustrated just answering call to call. And he had been doing CrossFit for a couple of years and he liked working out. And I convinced him to start going to the weightlifting club. And it was fascinating to watch how going in there and coaching these kids and interacting with them and watching them get stronger and grow as human beings really turned the guy around. And I think in some ways may have saved his career. And that wasn't the only thing we did to change things for him, but it was a huge part of it. This job we can get really, really jaded doing this job. And the only way to avoid that is to seek out positive interactions. I always talk about, if you're a white guy who grew up in a mostly white community and you went to a mostly white school and you come back, you get hired as a police officer and you go into a community, as an example, say it's a primarily African-American community, you're not going into that neighborhood for positive things necessarily. That's not why people call us. That's not why we get sent there. And if your only interactions with African-American people is when you're having to arrest them or you're responding there because they've been the victim of a crime, it can really negatively impact your perception of people who look different than you. And it requires that we go out there and seek out relationships with people who look different than us when we're not taking an enforcement stance or coming from that, because otherwise we just get jaded. And I really worry about these, biases that we may have that we may not even know about that develop over time. And it could be a bias about a way somebody looks or where they live or what kind of job they do. And that's what we do as human beings. We all develop those biases. But the only way to avoid the negative impact of those biases is to, again, seek positive relationships when you're not in a crisis. So
I may be going on a little bit of a tangent here because I had to step out for a second, but I'm curious as to how your leadership style, if at all, has changed as you went through the ranks and into the chief position that you are now.
I think as a young officer, I call it running and gunning. New cops love to go out there and chase bad guys. And, it's like every 10-year-old boy's dream job to drive fast and carry a gun and do all that kind of stuff. And I was a good patrol officer. I went out there and I did good police work. Because of where I grown up, I had that foundation of community. But when you're working graveyard shift on patrol, those opportunities for these positive interactions are far and few between. So as I've kind of moved on with my career and gone to different positions, it's become that much more important that I, not only for myself, but for the other officers who work for me, that I create opportunities by having, formal programs and informal opportunities for them to have these interactions. So, I started wearing a uniform, working for the police department when I was 17 years old as a community service officer in a city called Pleasanton, California. I was driving a police car wearing a uniform without a gun. I would, collect evidence at crime scenes and write crime reports and issue parking tickets and things like that. And then after doing that for a couple of years, I got hired by the Hayward Police Department where my dad had been a cop. And I was a community service officer there for about 3 years. I ended up leaving there as a senior jailer where I was a supervisor in the jail. Then I got hired by Port of Seattle Police Department. And I really didn't like that job because working for the port, it didn't really have as much sense of community. Your community was the other employees at the airport, but the traveling public kind of came through. And I really missed that opportunity to get to know the public that I worked for. So then I got hired by the sheriff's office, and I worked our Southeast precinct. I was a master police officer for a few years. I actually worked the city of Covington, where I'm the chief now, for as patrol officer. And then I went to our Southwest precinct in South Seattle area as a master police officer for a few years. And then again, that's where I kind of started developing these ideas and these kind of this desire to have more relationships with the community. And my brother actually was a patrol officer nearby in SeaTac, and he used to do a kind of an informal shop with the cop program, so we would help him with that. And then I went to the special assault unit as a detective and investigated sexual assault, child abuse, child death, and elder abuse. And for me, learning to interact with kids who had been through something so traumatic really opened a new window to how these interactions should go and how you can build trust even during these trying times. And that's when I really started getting back involved with the community, because I was dealing with these kids on after these horrific circumstances, and it's really hard to build trust with them, and communicate with them when they're under that kind of stress and when they've distrusted the authority because the system is so broken and doesn't provide for their basic needs. So, that's where this fire really got lit in me. And my whole life, my brother and I always talked about opening up a nonprofit gym one day, and because of, sports and exercise were so important to us growing up. But each of those things that I did coming up, kind of layered on these different ideas. Eventually, then I got promoted. I went back to our Southeast precinct as a patrol sergeant, and then I got drafted into internal investigations. And when I worked in internal investigations, what I found out was, I went in there thinking that I would find out I'd be frustrated because the department was mistreating employees or, was trying to hold good cops down and so on and so forth. And when I got there, I found out that there were just some cops doing really horrible things. And every single officer who I investigated who either got criminally charged or had any other kind of severe discipline, every single one of them had challenges and stressors that they were facing, oftentimes not even related to work, that I think contributed to them thinking it was okay to do these bad things that resulted in their discipline. So, that really to me made me decide that I wanted to find opportunities to make an improvement for our profession and our department to better support our people, to avoid those pitfalls, right? So then my next job after that, I managed our training unit for about 4 or 5 years. And that's when I started this relationship with Highline School District, trying to start the Badges and Barbells program. And all of those programs I'm talking about, we do under the umbrella of our the King County Police Activities League. And that's a program that's been around for about 20 years in King County. And initially we did it to support youth sports programs like football, soccer, baseball. But over the years, the things like Shop with a Cop have kind of become our bread and butter there. So in the training unit, that's when I got back involved with that organization and tried to get that ball rolling with the Badges and Barbells.
I'm curious if you've seen, you were speaking earlier about that officer who started to do the to work with you on the barbells and badges, and you saw that his outlook on the job changed. I'm curious if you noticed a difference, if you ever were able to see it in the field, but just how he interacted with the public, him, or if you have any other examples in a job capacity, like how those interactions outside of work affected how he or anyone else works on the job.
So as a leader, we have a lot of discretionary time, and we as a leader get to choose what we're going to focus on. And for me, the thing that I focus on most when I talk about leading my people is helping them develop emotional intelligence and self-awareness. And for him in particular, that opportunity to really step back from the part of the job that he disliked, interacting with people who just committed crimes, became very negative for him. And focusing a little bit more on the positive side of it really helped him improve his emotional intelligence, his self-control, helped him be much more self-aware, so he understood better how his words and actions were impacting, not just his job, but all the people around him. And so, I mean, with him, and even if you were to talk to him about it, I think he would agree that it's been big. And it wasn't just Badges and Barbells; it was a lot of things. We really worked together to try to address what he knew was potentially going to be a problem. And he had never done anything bad or wrong, but he was unhappy and thought about getting out of law enforcement. And he's a good cop. I mean, he knows who's committing the crimes. He knows where to find them. He's smart. He writes good paper. Eventually he became our detective, and He's a good friend of mine. He's a good cop. And, I think that, with whether it be through that method or something else, to just the emotional intelligence, self-awareness piece is the critical piece. And yet that's not what we do. In law enforcement, when we take promotional tests, it's measuring our technical ability. It has nothing to do with our leadership ability or emotional intelligence or self-awareness. In fact, when I worked internal investigations, we did a study and we went back and we looked at a group of officers who had mostly been terminated or had caused a lot of problems in our department. And we looked at what were the factors that we had missed in their background. And the consistent factor we found is that we were not measuring emotional intelligence or self-awareness in the hiring process. And, and yet we still don't do a good job of it. And our promotional tests don't measure that. And, too many of these things are just measuring BS ability and not how do you interact with human beings. So because we're not catching it in the hiring process or promotional process, we need to figure out a way to develop it over time and identify people who are weak in those areas and find out how to improve it. So
kind of in the same vein, what do you feel are some of the, I didn't give you a little prep for this in an email, so no worries if you have to think about this question, but what do you think are like the foundational traits of a good leader? Because, part of our concept for this show is that leadership is not dictated by rank necessarily. So it's the qualities and characteristics that you exhibit. So what are some of the things that that you try to exhibit in your own leadership role?
Maybe it sounds like an oral board answer, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about and kind of developing kind of my guiding principles and what I think make me improve as a human being and as a leader. And kind of the three words that I really focus on are courage, compassion, and competence. And I'll talk about those in reverse. So the competence piece is I need to know my job inside and out. And I also need to know the job of the people who are working for me as best I can. And that doesn't mean when I start a new assignment that I have to know everything about that assignment or everything about everybody, what everybody's doing below me, but I need to have that child's mind when I enter it and be willing to, learn that job from inside out. Right. So, and every job I've had, I've stayed in assignments usually for about 5 years. And it takes about 5 years to become an expert in something if you're doing it full time. So I think that first piece, that competence, is you have to be really good at your job. You have to know the technical aspects. The next part, though, is compassion. I was listening to a podcast one time, and it was a Buddhist monk, and I cannot remember the podcast or who the Buddhist monk was, but he talked about the difference between empathy and compassion. And empathy is, being able to walk in somebody else's shoes and understand their suffering. Compassion is having empathy, but doing something about it. Right. So, and as a leader, we need to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of the public so we know what they want. But we also have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people who work for us to better understand what they need. But then we have to take the next step, which is what people forget, and that's do something about it, right? So when we recognize people are suffering or struggling, we need to be able to step up and address those issues and be creative in how we do that, right? And then the last one is the one, courage. And I'm not talking about, running into an active shooter situation and taking a bullet, that sometimes that's what courage looks like. But when I talk about courage, I mean doing the hard work even when it's not popular. A lot of the assignments I've had, a lot of things I've done in my life probably were not popular. If people looked at those singular decisions, they may say that they didn't agree with them or whatever. But I've always done them in a way where I take as many of the factors I can into account, and then I step up and do the right thing no matter what. And I think as a leader, if you're not going to have that kind of courage, if you're going to either bow down to public pressure or pressure from your elected official or your boss, you're making decisions for the wrong reasons. And every new cop, when I was in the training unit, I used to run our pre and post academy training. So when we hire new officers, we'd have them for a couple of weeks for training, then they'd go to the academy for 6 months, and then we'd have them for about 5 weeks after. And I used to always tell them, I'd say, when you're doing this job, if you don't have another option, you're in the wrong profession, because sometimes there's a circumstance or an event that's going to end your career, even if you were trying to do the right thing. And if you are doing your job with so much fear of losing that job because it's all you have, you're going to make a lot of mistakes because you aren't going to have the right kind of courage to do the right thing. And I've many times made decisions in my career where I thought that, maybe I would lose an assignment or lose my job because, what I was doing may not have been popular, or sometimes it was outside of policy, but it was still the right thing to do. But I always did that knowing that I was willing to pay that price or that consequence. And I think that's leadership. So, like on my website for my business and when I teach, I always talk about that, courage and compassion and competence, because for me, that's what I try to develop and build over time.
Well, I don't know about you, Lexi, but just that little speech on the 3 C's makes me want to go out and change the world. Like that's
Copyright trademark. How's that?
Yeah, that's pretty good. That was inspiring. I was getting a little goosebumpy there.
I feel like you're in my head. I've often talked about the difference between empathy and compassion, especially in these times where it's so easy, especially for sergeants, to be sort of over empathetic to the negativity that's going on. And I see sergeants' roles, especially now, is to be that buffer of, trying to change the culture and trying to see the positive, and not being so empathetic with what's going on with patrol officers that they feed into that negativity. And I think that is more in the realm of compassion, like you said, like seeing the issue and doing something about it.
Yeah. One of my biggest fears right now is that we're going to de-police and cops just aren't going to want to go out there and do their job, because we're struggling right now. And the defund the police movement is because people don't see the value that we bring. Mm-hmm. And if we stop bringing any value at all, we're only going to reinforce this idea of defund the police, right? We need to go out there and do the right thing and be brave. We need to do the job that we know we were hired to do. Over time, the public's going to change what that looks like. And you have to be okay with that. You have to move forward and continue doing the right thing, even if the resources are limited or whatever. And like you said, that's, just, talking trash about the public, or just listening to your complaints from your officers and leaving them be. To a point, you have to acknowledge their complaints. A lot of those complaints are real, but that's not leadership to just leave it there. I always talk about creating an action plan and, SMART goals, ones that are, specific and measurable and actionable and, time bound. And of course, I can't forget the R now that I'm on a podcast, but anyway, you need to help your officers do that. So if the officer's struggling because they say, the public doesn't value us anymore, they don't want us here, why do we even bother going out? Well, let's go find something we can go out and do, because again, we're going to undermine ourselves if we don't.
Yeah, there's always something. I know, your actions and your involvement with the community speaks volumes, but I was just curious if you had the opportunity to give like a verbal message to community members or people that are, experiencing a lot of distrust with law enforcement. If you had a message for them, what would you kind of like them to know about about law enforcement, your thoughts on law enforcement? I mean, you come from such an incredible lineage, and you've dedicated so much time to various communities through all of your work. I'm just curious what you'd like them to know.
So the only answer is the hardest answer, and that's we need to get to know each other as human beings.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that simple. If I don't want to even call it politics. I think it's beyond that right now. If our entire society is divided, whatever the category is, you're going to find people on the left and the right of it, and they view each other as enemies, and until we can get back to a position where we start viewing each other as human beings again, start treating each other with respect and dignity, even if we have different ideas, we're going to continue struggling. I'll tell you this, I've been doing this job long enough. When I started was shortly after the Rodney King incident. And down in California, we had a lot of political unrest as a result of, especially after the acquittals. I saw what's happening now back then. Everybody who's living in this now thinks it's the worst ever and so on and so forth. My dad saw it in the 1960s when he started in Oakland. This is what happens when we have a pendulum that swings, where we in law enforcement go way over to one side with the law and order perspective. And then the public reacts to that when crime goes down, because they don't see the value in that when they're not feeling in danger anymore. The pendulum will swing back and we'll go back toward something other than that law and order perspective. And inevitably, crime rate will go up again, and that enforcement side of our job is going to become relevant and important again. We have to be professionals that ride that wave and stay the course. But we have to do it in a way that we get credit for our hard work by acting like human beings, not robot. I think the public views us as robot ninjas, and we're not. In my department, we're a large department. We've got about 800 officers. And when I went to the training unit, we had not had defensive tactics training or firearms training in 10 years. If the public knew that there's cops walking around that literally had not had any training at all in defensive tactics or firearms for 10 years, and then they wonder why we struggle when we have to use force, no wonder why, right? And we hadn't had communications training. We hadn't talked about emotional intelligence or self-awareness forever in our department, right? So my goal when I went to the training unit was to try to rebuild those programs, because we needed that to make better decisions. Making those better decisions would help us gain some public support. But when you feel confident because your skills are high, you're much less likely to need those skills, right? So I think right now in law enforcement, I know in my department with budget cuts, we've done less and less training over the years. And when we start having more training, we have a better skill set, we're going to be less likely to use force. And I think over time that the public's going to recognize that and start giving us some of the credit that we think we deserve. I don't disagree with a lot of the public complaints right now about law enforcement. I see a lot of these events and I hear cops defending these officers who do horrific things. I'm not going to defend a cop who does something bad. There are plenty of cops in this country who should not be cops. I work internal investigations. As a result of my investigations, people got fired. Some of them got criminally charged. They got demoted or given days off. I'm okay with that because this is a tough job that not everybody can do. But, we do need to do a better job of communicating with the public about the realities of our job, so that they're concerned about the right things and not just the popular things to be concerned about. And, I think that's on police leadership. I think we measure the wrong things. When a typical chief does their annual report to their city council, they're going to report on things like crime rates and 911 response times, right? And if I'm a member of the public, if I don't care how fast the cop gets there if he acts like an asshole when he arrives, right? So as a police chief, if that's all I'm measuring is something like a crime rate or how quickly we're getting to a call, it's completely losing the importance of how we treat people. And those are things that are really hard to measure. Public sentiment is the best way to measure that. And right now, public sentiment is very low. So we must be doing something wrong.
Incredible, man. Well, that's too long for a show quote, but it was full of meaty goodness. That was very concise, very, very well said.
So I guess the show quote could be, I don't care how fast you get there if you're an asshole when you arrive.
Yes.
Yes, that's great.
I always say there's a fine line between officer safety and just being a dick.
True.
Yeah.
Lexi, you got anything else that you want to touch on?
I just want to say that you are extremely inspiring to me. Like all the things that I've become involved with in the last 6 months or so just echo what you've been saying so closely that it just gives me a lot of hope and inspiration that there's people out there that have been doing this work for a long time and that have that expertise and are on the same page. And I just want you to know that I would work for you any day because you are clearly a fantastic leader. So thank you for all that you've said today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to actually piggyback on that. I think your job in internal affairs is not an easy one when you had that role. And I think that's one of the things that stands out to me is just we need more officers like that holding other officers accountable. And I think it's just fantastic because it just goes against, I think, the stereotype that we have this unbreakable thin blue line that no matter what, officers are going to stand up for other officers regardless of how egregious their behavior is. And that's just not the case. I mean, we are all humans and we know right from wrong. Oh, I'd like to think so in law enforcement. And I'm just so happy that someone like you was in that role and was able to do some good in that capacity in addition to all the other things that you've done.
I just want to say, I mean, I appreciate it, but I think one of the problems we have is that people like us who are trying to make things better don't get recognition. And I think we're pretty normal. Everybody asks me like, well, the good cop, I'm a pretty normal cop. As far as chiefs go, there are a lot of other chiefs doing much better things than me, but nobody wants to hear that story. So I appreciate you guys trying to give a platform so that people trying to do better have a way to share their story, because it doesn't make the news right now. And when I get quoted in the newspaper, they don't put in the quotes that I think are important. They put in the quotes that support a narrative that they may be telling, and that's the same for a lot of other people in leadership right now. So thank you guys for doing this and putting it out there, and anything I can do to support you guys, let me know.
Yeah, and if people want to, if they're kind of touched by your leadership philosophy, they can head to sargetraining.com. Is that correct?
Sure. That's
okay.
a good way
You're
to
like,
reach
sure.
me.
I don't care. Yeah, I don't. That's yeah. Well, good. Well, that's where we'll send people if they have questions. Do they have your permission to email you if they're interested in more?
Yeah, there's a contact page on my website as well.
Okay.
But most of what I do is more for law enforcement. I do a lot of trainings on things like trauma-informed interviewing and procedural justice, and I do a lot of like audits and reviews of things like use of force, and so it's all the kind of not sexy stuff, but any other groups, especially if they want to start some programs and want some advice about what not to do, I definitely mess a lot of stuff up when I was getting started in these things. So I love to share with other people kind of my experience just to help them if they want to get going.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Chief. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Have a good day.
You too.